Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for the lovely comments that everybody left me about my previous lesson on inspector calls. And I do apologize that I have not been on and have not posted very many more lessons, but I am hoping that is going to change when I get time. So what we're going to look at today, this is going to be the second lesson. We're going to do a variety of things. First of all, we are going to evaluate one of the characters, just start touching on one of the characters, Mr. Birling. And we're going to use some of the quotes that he presents. Now, that is also going to help us learn a bit more about the historical context of Inspector Calls and the time that it was written. And we are also going to learn about J.B. Priestley's use of dramatic irony. There's one key question that we are going to touch on. Okay, so that is what we're going to try to accomplish with this lesson. So here we go. Okay, so I realize that is a bit difficult to read, but don't worry because I have all of these quotes broken up and enlarged. But there are several quotes we are going to use that Mr. Birling makes sort of in the beginning and throughout the play. And these quotes do give a good character assessment of him. All right. Now, this is going to be a sort of matching exercise in the beginning. So we have a little grid here. Well, I mean, a little honeycomb, I should say, with about 6 pictures. Not all the quotes have a match. A couple of them can match with others. Not all the pictures have a match. So it's not just an A, B, C, D match. You need to think about these as well. Now, in the middle, there is a question. Why did Priestley write the play in 1945, but set the play in 1912? Okay, so just think about that. We're going to bring that up a bit more at the end of the lesson today. Okay, so let's move on with our first quote. Now, says Mr. Birling, he's speaking, and he says at one point in the play, last month, just because the miners came out on strike, there was a lot of talk about troubles in the future. Don't worry, we've seen the worst of it. Well, I've matched the picture on the actual slide, and that is, of course, of strikes. During that time, there were several strikes going on, lots of strike action, lots of labor unrest, people demanding more wages, people wanting more, and he foolishly thinks that they're through the worst of everything. Oh, it's just going to blow itself over. History will say that it doesn't. So here's a little explanation of that. In the early 20th century, saw a big movement away from an elite few controlling everything towards a situation where society tried to be more equal. You see the breaking down of the old Victorian and Edwardian society where you had, your very distinct class structure. That starts to break down. People are no longer working in sort of domestic jobs, or they're not working in agriculture. We've got the Industrial Revolution coming up. People are going out, they're earning their own money. They don't need to depend on these higher class people for work anymore. That starts to destroy things. Anybody who's ever watched Downton Abbey, that sort of lifestyle, that starts to tear away from about the First World War. By the Second World War, it's almost completely gone. There were an increasing number of strikes during this period and on the time after the play is set, undermining Mr. Birling again. In the play, remember, he is a factory owner. He runs a business. He employs a lot of women. That's another thing that comes up later in the play. But people like him are being undermined. They are wanting more. People are going out and there's more competition for jobs, or more competition for workers. So sometimes they're forced to pay it. We also have, in this era of history, we have the suffragette movement starting. Women are wanting the vote. The women are wanting a voice. They're wanting equal wages, equal pay. This is how Eva Sharpe, who is one of the main characters in the play, gets herself into a little bit of trouble. She starts demanding, why shouldn't we get the same amount of money that men do? We're doing the same job. Women were becoming more insistent in their demands for equality. The suffragette movement becomes particularly militant at this time in history. They resorted to violent protests in some cases to get their point across. But this is what's going on. Okay, next quote he makes. Just because the Kaiser makes a speech or two, or a few German officers have too much to drink and begin talking nonsense, you'll hear people say that war is inevitable. And to that I say fiddlesticks. Well, I think we know what he's talking about here. Talking about this, World War I. And he's being very flippant about it. He's being like, oh, come on, the Kaiser's blah, blah, blah. He's just this spoiled rich king making all sorts of gestures. These Germans, they're just, nobody's going to take them seriously. It's all a load of rubbish. It's not going to happen. Well, it did happen. It happened, and it was very destructive. And even after it did happen, a lot of people were saying, oh, it's not going to last very long. If there is a war, it's going to be over and done with in a few months. Well, it went on for 4 years. And one of the worst wars in human history. It is still known as the war to end all wars because we've never seen anything like it. So Mr. Birling, again, in a bit of a state of denial, just doesn't believe these things are going to happen. He comes from a different world. He doesn't realize that the world is changing. Okay. Now, he says the world is developing so fast that it'll make war impossible. Well, he is right in one account. The world is developing. The world is changing. It's developing very quickly. But I think he's talking more about items in his factory. He's not talking about social and political change. He's not talking about these new ideas that are coming in. But that it'll make war impossible. No, in fact, it makes it more possible. It makes it more deadly, and it makes it more dangerous. Okay, so again, I picked those two pictures. I put the World War I picture on there because I think that is a legitimate match. The factory, I think that is what he is referring to. There is change. The Industrial Revolution is coming along, mass production of things. So I think that is the change he's referring to. Now this one doesn't have a picture, but I think you would have to almost be living in a box for the past 20 years not to get what he's talking about here. The Titanic. She sails next week. 46,800 tons. 46,800 tons. New York in 5 days in every luxury and unsinkable. Absolutely unsinkable. Well, we know it wasn't unsinkable. Anybody who has seen the film, anybody that has read anything on the Titanic knows that it didn't make it. It did sink. And I believe that's a picture from the movie, the most recent film. Now he is not the only one that thought that. Lots of people thought that ship was unsinkable because of just the manpower that went into making it. But again, he thought this luxurious ship, nothing can stop it. Well, it did. Another one of his quotes, and we're in for a time of steadily increasing prosperity. Well, for a time, they were. 1912 up into the First World War. The First World War brought a lot of boom economies to a lot of nations. The 1920s continued on until, of course, there was the 1929 stock market crash where the world was plunged into a recession and then later a depression. And it had knock-on effects to the United States, various countries in Europe. Germany was particularly hard hit, remember, by the Treaty of Versailles, any of you who study history, which some people blame as a precursor for the Second World War. But yeah, there was a bit of prosperity, but then the world economy took a massive dive. So in the years after the play is set, there was economic depression, which was not helped by the cost of the war. So we had the First World War. Again, we had mass destruction in the First World War. Somebody had to pay for all that. Germany was told they had to pay for it, but could they do it? Now that did create a lot of work opportunity, but again, when the Wall Street crash came in 1929, that plunged the world into an economic depression. Okay, now he's being a little prophetic here. In the 40s, by that time, you'll all be living in a world that'll have forgotten all these capital versus labor agitations and all these silly war scares. Again, he's downplaying what's going to happen. Silly war scares. Well, these are not, well, we all know. We can look back now through the eyes of, the future and say these were not silly war scares. They actually happened. He's in denial again. He's saying, oh no, these wars, they're not going to happen. People are just, saber rattling. It's nonsense. People will have forgotten these capital versus labor agitations, these strikes, this tension between workers, between politicians, between fair wages. We'll have all forgotten about that by the 1940s. Well, the 1940s brought us the Second World War and probably even more of this type of economic unrest. That's the picture I matched with that one. And here we go. Where it kind of kicks off in the novel here, or the play, is Eva Sharpe is one of the characters. She's a worker in Mr. Birling's factory, and she decides to ask for more wages. Now, we won't go into too much about what happens to her in this lesson. We'll leave that for the future. But he makes a quote, I believe directly relating to her, saying, they suddenly decide to ask for more money. It's my duty to keep labor costs down. Well, of course, yes, that's true, but at the expense of certain people. So again, he's talking about women demanding more. And why would a woman want more money? Why does she need more money? That was the thought back then. Their jobs are to be wives and mothers. They don't need this extra money. Where's their husband? Not thinking that there are women that are probably on their own that don't want to work in domestic service. Why would we want anything other than that? But that was just the narrow-mindedness of the time and of a lot of men, especially men in his position. Okay. So that is Mr. Birling Speaks. Now, how accurate is Mr. Birling in his predictions? Well, we know that he was not accurate at all. Missed just about all of them. A couple of things he might have been right on in a certain instance, but wrong about the war. He didn't think that that was going to happen. Very wrong about the Titanic, but again, he wasn't the only one that thought that. About women, why would they want money? Why do they need more money? They don't need more money. Well, not totally unaware of the times. Okay, so this could imply, again, that Mr. Birling is just stuck in his old way of thinking. He's an older man, he's an aristocrat, sort of, he's a bit pompous. Refuses to believe in change, or maybe doesn't refuse to believe in change, but just can't accept or doesn't see it. Very resistant to change. Okay, so that is him. That is how these quotes sort of present him. He's just an old man stuck in his old way of life. Now, J.B. Priestley wrote An Inspector Calls in 1945. Yet he set the play in 1912. Now there's varying theories on this. Some people thought that he was disillusioned with life in 1945, so he set the novel back. And Mr. Birling is an example of, by the 1940s this will all be over with. That's maybe what we wanted, but didn't happen. But also, we get into this concept of what is dramatic irony. Well, dramatic irony is where the audience knows more than the characters. You see this in a lot of Shakespeare's plays. You see this a lot. We get information that the actual characters don't. Well, this is a great example of dramatic irony because this play is set 40 years before it takes place. A little bit more than that. We're reading it now in 2020. This is when I'm making this. So those of you that might be taking your GCSEs this year, we can look back with what we learned in history. So we know more. We know the Titanic sinks. We know what happens with World War I and later World War II. We've learned about the suffragette movement, that women eventually gain the vote and go on and make great strides in equality for pay, work, In the first lesson, we talked about the marriage bar and how before women were barred from a lot of professions just because they were women. That was taken away. So we know all this now. So that is another reason why he might have set the book so far in the past, was that for dramatic irony purposes. Now, finally, if you were to get this question on an exam, explain how Priestley has used dramatic irony to present his ideas to the audience. Well, you could use Mr. Birling as an example. You have a perfect example of him. He uses Mr. Birling's quotations as to express dramatic irony about how he's not aware of the future, but he refuses to believe in the possibility of a world war, of equal rights for women, of the Titanic sinking. So you could say Mr. Birling is a good tool for dramatic irony for these reasons. Okay. That is the end of this very quick lesson. Remember, this would, if you were to do this in a classroom, this would take a lot longer. If you're doing this one-to-one, again, it's been about 16 minutes. So anyway, I would encourage you to go through, look at some of these incidences, look at some of these historical events. Some are not as well known as others, and see how they fit into Inspector Calls. Have a look at Mr. Birling as a character, those of you that haven't read the book. Next time, we will actually get into the play a little bit and the first act. Okay, everybody, if you have any questions, please do post them in the comments. This will go on my YouTube channel. I can't promise how often I'm going to get videos up, but now that I am back in school and actually lesson planning quite regularly, I will try to get them up as soon as I can. Thank you for the comments. And keep them coming. Please do subscribe, and good luck, everybody.